Hey there, Skullheads. I'm Snags.
And I'm Ol Silky.
And tonight we're going to talk about one of the most important bands in the history of rock and roll, and full stop, the first band that fully embodied punk rock before it was called punk rock. The one and only, the legendary, the mighty Stooges.
The Stooges, the proto-punk band.
The band that laid down the template for all these other cats.
They really did.
Yeah.
But in a odd way, they're also very influenced by a lot of other things.
Yep.
What's just phenomenal is these guys.
So before we get into it, though, I just want to encourage everybody out there to buy an album and mail it to Silky. It's called Mickey Dolenz Sings REM. And this is Silky's a huge REM fan, and he loves the Monkees.
Oh yeah.
And so Mickey Dolenz,
top two.
Mickey Dolenz Sings REM. Buy as many copies of that CD as possible and mail them to Silky.
As soon as I get one of these fuckers in the mail, I'm going to go on a road trip and kill every fucker that sends me one of those.
There's a few of you out there who know Silky's non-superhero identity, and you have his address. Buy Dolenz Sings REM on CD and mail it to him.
God, that sounds...
All right. Anyways, so I'm going to pimp the website, and then Silky's going to kick us off with a bit of origin story here on the Stooges. Go to snagsandsilky.com. Get you a hoodie, a mug, a decal, and a T-shirt. Go to snagsandsilky.com and download the sample version of Sink or Swim, which is a book we wrote. It's free just to download the sample, and it's so hilarious. You'll end up paying the full $6.99 for the Kindle.
It really is that good.
And we're not joking about that. It really is freaking hilarious.
All these years later, to go back and read something you wrote half your life ago, and it's surprisingly funny. But
the whole reason it's on Kindle is because we wrote this in our 20s, and I ran across the PDF a couple of years ago, and I read it, and I was just cracking up, and I was like, dude, we got to edit this, clean it up a little bit and put it on Kindle. And we spent a lot of time doing it solely because it's hilarious. We don't care who wrote it. We happen to be the geniuses who wrote it, but it really is objectively hilarious. Anyways, why don't you start laying down for these cats a bit of Stooges lore?
So the Stooges, they came out of Ann Arbor, Michigan, way up there where it's cold and chilly. They initially ran from 67 to 71, then kind of regrouped in 72 to 74, and then finally 2003 to 2016 is their kind of reign of being around. Some of the members in the band, Iggy Pop, Scott and Ron Ashton, Dave Alexander, Bill Cheatham, Steve McKay, James Williamson, and Mike Watt, just to name some of the people that have been Stooges. But before I really get into the Stooges, in the 50s, they figured out how to suck the life out of rock and roll. And they would take something dangerous and edgy and flood the market with Fabian or Perry Como. Rock and roll in the 70s, you had the same kind of situation where when rock and roll started, you had this edgy, dangerous form of music. People didn't know what to do. And so the record companies would take this popular thing and chip the edges off and make it a sellable product. And they did this again in the 70s. it was a rock and roll was co-opted by a political industrial complex with corrupt performers, with evil manager owners who were going to create whatever they thought was the best product for them, whether you wanted it or not. And like I said, the minute something real comes out, it gets replaced by a softer, smoother, overproduced bullshit band. That's why the 90s went to shit.
That's why you start off with Nirvana and you end up with Creed.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many new possible outcomes, and most of those bands either didn't even make it out, or they would morph into some unrecognizable entity. Red Hot Chili Peppers, just
what the hell?
watered down,
What the hell happened to that
soulless garbage. It's cultural treason. You get American Idol, America's Got Talent. Some of the biggest bands have been created in meetings. These kids have been force-fed trash music, safe, image-conscious pop music through the years, through those decades. But
Silky is quoting Iggy Pop. Rant. Yeah, he's quoting Iggy Pop here from this killer documentary.
The movie Gimme Danger, but he really taps into, when you think about it, just how awful each decade that starts with something good and goes straight to shit.
It just constantly happens.
Continues to happen.
I think one of the examples in the documentary is they replaced Elvis with Fabian, right?
Yeah,
everything, and even Elvis with later Elvis. I mean, come on.
Yeah, it's like they're caught off guard. Oh my God, what's this selling that all the kids are raving about? Oh, well, let's recreate that, but we'll be in control of it.
Let's pour some sugar on it and fucking ruin it.
It's just terrible. You look at Def Leppard's first 3 albums. Amazing, really good rock and roll. First 2 maybe better. Third one produced and done well, still good songs. And then that was it. Everything after that you're like, what the anyway, so during the late 60s, the psychedelia at its peak, the Stooges came in on the scene. They had a very raw, primitive style. They were really the underbelly of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Grimy, dangerous, blue-collar garage rock is one way to describe them. But to me, they were a punk version of the Doors. Vulgar, Ron and Scott's rhythm section with pounding, simplistic riffs, raw energy channeled into like an insane or that was all channeled into Iggy's bare-chested annex. There's footage of him balancing on top of the crowd at a show with these jeans that are like almost see-through in the back, and he's smearing peanut butter on himself and throwing handfuls of it into the crowd. They were just electric, just pure rock and roll, so much promise. But just like the MC5, the drugs and lack of focus would drastically mar what they might have done. Their musical importance, though, to me, and I'm sure Snags would agree, it far surpasses any biographic notes or documentary. If you listen to the passion in Gimme Danger or the angst of 1969, the drone of I Want to Be Your Dog, even the Doors-esque song Anne.
I just wanted to throw in the Doors you mentioned a couple times.
Yeah.
And there's a great story about when Iggy came back. He's in a few garage bands, They kind of fall apart. He goes out to Chicago. He's playing the blues with a bunch of these cats as a drummer. And at some point decides he wants to go back and create the blues for his generation.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want to be a drummer anymore. And he comes back and he's trying to figure out what to do. Well, the Doors came and they played the local university there. So he goes to check out the Doors, and there were all these frat kids at that concert. And he said he just sat there and watched Jim Morrison antagonize them for the entire concert.
That's beautiful.
And it was an anti-performance. Like most of these performers go out and they want to be loved. Jim Morrison didn't give a fuck.
Well, and Jim knew that he knew, I think Jim had a brief glimpse of just how amazing the Doors were. And so to walk out on stage full confidence and look at these frat boy goobers that just want to hear Light My Fire, yeah, you're going to antagonize the shit out of them. You know, that's
what he did. And that inspired Iggy. So you're totally right. They are a punk version of the Doors.
Yeah. And really punk, I always thought punk was just plug in and hit the guitar strings as fast as you can and scream. But punk is really just getting up on stage. You look at the spoken word that Black Flag did. I mean, you could get up and just do a country song, and that's punk because of the attitude that you're putting behind it.
And there were plenty of cowpunk bands that did just that.
Yeah. But I just, you hear a lot of Jim Morrison in Iggy's vocal style. And it's funny, and they were on Elektra. So, but as I was describing some of their songs, the song Anne is very Doors-esque to me. The suggestive of Real Cool Time, the free-form meditative thing, We Will Fall. They were simple lyrics with raw power riffs. They just destroy the bullshit by refusing to sing about politics or current events. They plugged in and rocked. And that's what it's been about, from Buddy Holly and Little Richard to the Ramones and Motorhead. Praise Lemmy. Danny Fields went to see them in '68, and he saw two amazing bands.
This is a cat who worked with the Doors.
Yeah.
Danny Fields.
And you can chime in on this. They were offered, so he gets on the phone and says, look, I got a really big band, and then I got a smaller band. Now, was he saying that he saw that the MC5 was the bigger band?
MC5 were totally the bigger band. MC5 were very popular.
$20,000 for MC5 and $5,000 for the Stooges.
Yeah.
And if you look at their careers, they eked out 3 albums apiece initially.
And disappeared.
They were completely riddled by drugs. They completely lost their way. Almost a mirror image of each other.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is I think the Stooges albums are far superior than MC5 in production.
And songwriting too.
Songwriting, just everything. Yeah. And then, but if you look at the lyrics, they're just very simple, repetitive, and they're not so much about something as just a couple of lines, and then just repeated over just raw, just razor sharp guitar riffs. It's just interesting, an interesting thing to know.
It was basically, you had this growth of rock and roll, almost an evolution, right? That I think it started with Bill Haley and the Comets, the first guy to kind of amalgamate the blues and country and everything into this rock and roll thing. And then Elvis, he kind of kicked the door open, and then Elvis just took it took it to the new heights. The Beatles came along, and the peak of the evolution is probably the song "A Day in the Life," where you go from rock around the clock to "A Day in the Life," and there's nothing else you can do after that. And the Stooges were bringing it right back down to rock around the clock with a new attitude. And Bill Haley and the Comets were very shocking when they first came out, and mothers were hiding their children and locking the doors. And the Stooges, their generation's version of that, just let's freak everybody out, but keep the songwriting simple.
Well, like you look at what was popular, Marrakesh Express.
Yeah, all that hippie shit.
Just god awful. I've always hated that song, and it's funny in that Gimme Danger documentary, he literally points that song out and then mentions how some of these he said something like the top 5 peace and love bands were all created in a meeting, and you just wonder. I mean, you brought up the Monkees earlier; they were extremely popular. American answer to the Beatles, but they were created for a TV show,
Yeah. I don't think the Monkees were ever taken as seriously as Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, but
I hope not.
Those guys see it. Crosby, Stills, and Nash, they're all industry veterans. They'd all been around forever. They've been in different
and it may have been a meeting like, hey, let's get the Birds. Totally, the Birds were huge.
Yeah, totally could have been a meeting, but just stylistically, all that stuff needed to be kicked in the ass.
Kicked in the ass, absolutely. And that's
this Sgt. Pepper aesthetic taken to ridiculous extremes with bands like Yes and Genesis, and all this artsy fartsy shit just needed to be kicked right in the ass, and that's what the Stooges did.
Prog rock has its moments, but when you are noodling for 45 minutes and you call it winter solstice, fuck off. Just fuck off. God damn it, man. Anyway, so 1968, Ron Ashton actually calls up Mo Howard, to discuss using the name The Stooges for the band, And what's great is, and this was in that Gimme Danger movie as well, but
which we will link at the website, and it was directed by Jim Jarmusch. Yeah.
Allegedly, Mo Howard says, "Hey, I don't give a fuck what you call your band as long as it's not the Three Stooges." Which I just love that. I like the image of maybe Mo walking into his kitchen to grab the phone that's hanging there with the long yellow cord. Hello, who is this?
Just the fact that Ron Ashton and Mo Howard had a fucking conversation.
And just that there was a time.
Two of my favorite people in the world, right there.
There was a time when you could randomly call up Mo Howard. Much like me reaching out to Albert Bouchard and getting him on the you never know, kids. If you find a phone number, give it a call. You never.
If Mo Howard was still alive, we'd absolutely try to get him on the podcast. And same with Ron Ashton. But
but anyway, so that is the Stooges, and then they go. If you listen to that first album, they started recording in '68. They're out in California at Elektra Studios, and I've always, maybe because it's Elektra, I don't know, but the guitar work on that first album, I just feel like I'm in the hills in San Francisco or LA, just very California and youth, just very much like when you listen to the Misfits. It captures that youth energy and angst, and that first Stooges record is very much the same for me. I would say that Iggy would argue that they are heart and soul a Detroit band, and I wouldn't argue that, but I just always felt they were, California anti-hippie,
they're definitely anti-hippie. This album was recorded. The first album was recorded in New York, though.
Oh,
Yeah.
see,
So
so
they go to.
I missed the whole, because I always, when I listen to it right now, I would
You're talking about the
feel
vibe.
like I'm in,
Yeah.
yeah,
What it reminds you of.
yeah.
But and I can totally see that. So they go to New York, and they get hooked up with John Cale from the Velvet Underground.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because when you banter about the names of the bands who started punk rock, you know, people throw out MC5. They definitely had a hand in it. The Velvet Underground always gets mentioned. They definitely had a hand in it. And he talks in that Gimme Danger documentary about how the Velvet Underground directly influenced the Stooges, and with some of the simple songs and the droning kind of sound. And I can totally see that. So John Cale produced this first album, and I like it. But when I heard Funhouse for the first time, it kind of ruined the first album for me, because then I knew what the Stooges with both balls hanging really low sounded like.
Well,
Funhouse,
ah,
Funhouse is their zenith. But
yeah,
the
that's
first
their Led
album,
Zeppelin too. It's just
yeah,
fucking perfect.
and but the first album, it's got a lot of good songs on it. 1969, I Want to Be Your Dog, No Fun,
Little Dog,
um,
Not
yeah,
Right.
yeah. So it's a classic album. And again, when that came out, and you listen to it, it's punk rock. And when that came out, probably the closest thing to that existed before was, you know, garage rock bands. But again, nothing. This sounds like a very early version of a punk album, and
Yeah,
and
they captured what the Doors had come out in 67, and that first album has the end, and just the Doors were dangerous. You did not know what Jim was going to do, and I feel like this first Stooges album really captures that same energy. But like, Real Cool Time, he's calling someone up. Is he calling a dude up to just hang out and drink beers? Is he calling a chick up and says,
I think
"Yeah,
it's,
you
yeah,
know what I'm gonna do"? You know,
yeah.
like, you don't know what's gonna,
And if you look at the lyrics for 1969, it's another year for me and you, another year with nothing to do.
yeah,
Those are punk lyrics.
yeah,
Ramones, Now I Want to Sniff Some Glue is right after that thematically,
absolutely,
you know.
absolutely.
And
And having nothing to do is dangerous. You know,
yeah, it's just this bored suburban youth thing. And I've always felt like punk rock was a kind of well, this is in the this band is recording punk rock when the Beatles are still together.
yeah,
But I've always felt like punk rock was kind of the 70s and 80s version of suburban youth version of the blues. It's
yeah,
people,
early rock and roll is just white blues.
yeah,
Uh, Rockabilly is country blues.
yeah.
Um,
But
and
it's just people lamenting their suffering um, from where they're at.
yeah,
And you're a suburban youth and you got nothing to do, you know, it's boring. Just let's sing about that. You don't have to sing about you know, Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, or, you know, this spiritual
or,
blah blah
or
blather.
smiling on your brother. You know,
Yeah, I'm gonna
um,
sing about sitting around and having nothing to do.
yeah, yeah. Uh, um, the other thing about that first album is they would the song was 2, 3, 4 minutes long, right? So they got that part, but then they would jam, and the songs would be 7, 8, 10 minutes long, and they were like, yeah, I can't. They had like 4 songs, and their producers like, I can't release this. I don't have enough songs, and so they realized that, hey, we got to trim these songs off, and just do the good bits. But what's interesting is the 2005 reissue, like Anniversary Deluxe Expanded. You get the John Cale mix of the whole album. And then there's an alternate version of 1969. But what's really cool is Anne and No Fun. You get the full version of how they were recording at the time, where they'd have the song and then they would just jam for a while.
Right.
So it's kind of cool that you get those.
Probably closer to the live versions they ended up playing, but yeah, they the only long song on the album is "We Will Fall," which is very repetitive. I always felt like that song didn't really fit on the album, but Ron Ashton and Iggy Pop loved that song. They feel like it's so weird. It's just
I always felt it set them apart and kept them from going down. I mean, how many bands, late 60s, the Seeds,
Sonics,
the Question Marks,
Question Mark and the Mysterians.
Yeah. Just how many of these bands just kind of were that garage rock and
Right.
didn't just petered out. The Lovin' Spoonful is another one. They had some hits, obviously, but they were, white jeans and frat boy shirts and shit.
Yeah.
And the Stooges, I think any band you see, like if you look at, I hate to bring Red Hot Chili Peppers up again, but if you Anthony Kiedis up on stage with his shirt off, he's just going through the motions of being Iggy Pop.
Yeah, and they've covered Search and Destroy. The thing, when you get into the argument about who was the first real punk band, look at what band is the most covered by punk bands. It's the Stooges by a long shot. The Damned covered them. Sex Pistols covered them. Everybody covered them. It's just goes on and on.
And there's approachable songs. They're easy to play. Yeah. I mean, you look at the just that infectious droning guitar riff for "I Want to Be Your Dog," and you can jump 15 years to Bauhaus doing Bela Lugosi's Dead,
or Sonic Youth covering that song early in their career, which they did. It's just it's never ending.
Yeah.
But that the first album was the Stooges basically getting produced a little bit by John Cale, and it's kind of a slightly tamed down version of the Stooges, but it's unmistakably them, and the songwriting is great. And then they go out to LA afterwards when it's time to record the next album, and they're kind of just let loose in the studio, and that's where really I think their masterpiece is born. But what do you got on Funhouse? Hip us to your notes on Funhouse.
Well, Funhouse, like you said, they'd gone out to LA. They just shred on these songs. There's a box set that came out that's literally the entire Funhouse sessions, and it's ridiculous. You're a fly on the wall watching each song come together, and I would say it's really only for almost like reading a book. You're gonna read it once or twice. You can't beat just having the original version. It's 7 or 8 songs, and I think it's 7 songs. Side 1, Down on the Street, is probably my favorite Stooges song. I love the whole rhythm to this song. I remember holding my daughter when she was like a year old and just dancing in front of the Bluetooth speaker and moving her up and down to the rhythm of this song. And she was laughing her ass off and really into it. And it's just a great jam. But the whole album is just amazing. And that last song, LA Blues, is just a scream fest.
Let's look at the songs on this album because it's pretty much flawless. Down on the Street,
it's jamming. Like Rainbow Rising. It's 6 or 7 songs and solid as you can get, you know.
And here's the deal: you had Dave Alexander had this killer. The only bass player I could compare him to, probably for different reasons, though, is Eric Avery in those early Jane's Addiction albums, where you had this bass player where the bass lines had their own identity and they really locked down the sound of the band and they grooved, man. And probably the bass lines, I'm guessing, were written by Ron Ashton because they would mirror the guitar, the guitar licks that Ron Ashton was playing. But you'd have this weighty, bouncy kind of bass just locking it down and locked in with Scott Ashton's drums. And then you'd have this wah-wah, this crazy screaming wah-wah, like Elmore James on methamphetamine and acid, just crazy screaming wah-wah sound laid on top of it, mirroring a lot of time the bass riffs or going off and doing solos. And that trio, that power trio of Scott, Ron, and Dave Alexander, it's a really unique sound, and it really comes out on this album. Just those three guys just and just unleashed. And then Iggy, as he's at a gig while they're out there, he sees this cat playing the saxophone, and Steve McKay at a gig, and he says, "Hey man, I want you to come down and play on our album." And he told them, and this is in the movie as well, he said, "I want you to play like Maceo Parker, who was James Brown's badass sax player." He said, "I want you to play like Maceo Parker on acid."
Yeah.
And this guy comes in, and you have that power trio doing their thing, just wailing and totally entranced. And then there's just wild saxophone skipping across the top of it.
Yeah, and it right there, it becomes jazz. You know, it's just so fucking good.
Iggy said his template for this album was Miles Davis's "Bitches Brew."
Yeah,
that's what inspired Funhouse. Like you said, the people that inspired them. It wasn't the Question Mark and the Mysterions or Paul Revere and the Raiders or any of these garage rock bands. Iggy had been there and done that. It was Frank Zappa and the Mother's Invention. It was
the Doors,
Miles Davis. Yeah. You have that early Doors inspiration.
That guy that was real free jazz. They talk about him in the movie. I've never heard of the guy. And
what are you talking about?
There was a guy in Gimme Danger that Iggy, they kind of did the We Will Fall, really kind of based on this jazz dude that made his own instruments and stuff. Yeah. He's in the movie, and whatever they played in the movie, I was like, so I didn't even bother looking.
But you have this wild power trio with this wild ass sax player just going off on top of their sound. And then lay on top of that Iggy just wailing with his lyrics, and he would always keep it simple, again, creating the template for punk rock. But the lyrics were always powerful. He'd have a powerful phrase or two and a couple verses and just wail those. It was hypnotic, really.
They really could have taken over and changed the course of the 70s.
It did indirectly. It totally did.
Right. But they could have really been in control of that. but they missed gigs. They showed up late. They would show up and play, and Iggy would jump into the crowd, and they would just play the same couple notes, waiting for Iggy to come back up on stage. Some nights he'd sing, some nights he would. It was just so. If they had just been more focused.
How were the Sex Pistols any different? And they did take over everything.
I would say the Sex Pistols were worse. And again, the Sex Pistols only had one album.
So that's my argument. That's not the reason that that they didn't take over, because the Sex Pistols were worse. Sid Vicious's bass was never plugged into an amp.
Yeah, no,
because he didn't know how to play. They were just as unreliable. The reason why the Sex Pistols blew up is because it was time, and the Stooges were before their time, so it wasn't quite. It wasn't post Watergate. It wasn't.
I think the Sex Pistols blew up because of their manager and almost like a P.T. Barnum. He knew how to sell and push it. And,
he was good, but also it was time.
Swingle, But timing. The Ramones, it all jumped. But I think had as brilliant as Funhouse is, and even Raw Power, great album. And if they just had more focus instead of drugs, they really could have.
They could have at least been around for when it was time to ride the crest of that wave.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, because they were just so solid. And what sucks is they drugged out and burnt themselves out. And eventually Scott and Ron come home. They go back home to Ann Arbor, and they're
we're not there yet, though. We got one more album. They kind of fall apart, and then David Bowie pulls them out of the pit.
Yeah, they go to England.
They got one more album.
But that's when so Iggy goes out there, and then he starts tapping the Stooges. This is in 1972. So they had another run with Raw Power, 1972 to 1974.
Basically, Dave Alexander, when they're on the Funhouse tour, Dave Alexander burns out. He's a total alcoholic, and they had some big important gig, and Dave just basically couldn't play. He's so drunk. He ended up dying of alcohol-related issues.
He died in 1975 of pulmonary edema.
Yeah.
He was 27 years old.
Right. So they have a couple of bass players they're using. They ended up adding the guy you briefly mentioned, Bill Cheatham, as a second guitar player for a little while. And then he was replaced by why am I drawing a blank on his name?
James Williamson.
And then the band kind of falls apart. So I think James Williamson was briefly in that version of the Stooges.
Yeah.
Falls apart, and Iggy's hanging out in New York and hears that David Bowie wants to meet him. David's down at Max's Kansas City, comes down and meets him, and basically David tells his manager, Tony DeFries, I want to do something musically with this cat. We're going to bring him out to London. And Iggy's out in London, and initially it's going to be an Iggy solo album, and he's not happy with the musicians that they're proposing to play with him, and he ends up bringing James Williamson out there, and then bringing the Ashton brothers out, and Ron Ashton at this point gets bumped to bass because there's only 4 of them. You can't do the 2 guitar, bass, drums lineup. I guess they could have tried it, but he's like, just get back on bass. Ron had played bass in some earlier bands. And that's the Raw Power lineup. And there's actually a great album on Spotify called the Heavy Liquid album. And it's full of a ton of songs they recorded while they were out there before they got to the Raw Power sessions.
Yeah.
And a lot of those actually sound better sonically than the Raw Power album songs, because they were being recorded by like the Rolling Stones engineer and a bunch of people. But when it was time to finally record the album, they were kind of left alone, and they kind of self-produced it, and they didn't quite know what they were doing.
Yeah, they hit gold though, because it's such a good record.
The songwriting is killer, and it's since been remastered. There's a Iggy Pop mix, probably that's the one to listen to. I think that might be the only one.
David Bowie's version is okay. I mean, it's the Stooges. It's those songs.
Yeah. He didn't produce that album. They produced it themselves, and that's why it sounds kind of muffled. And the guitar is kind of down in the mix, but there's an Iggy Pop mix where he just brings up the guitar, and
I like that one.
Yeah.
There's a deluxe version of this record, disc 2, because it's a 2 CD thing, is them live at Richards in Atlanta, Georgia in October of 73. And it's Stooges.
In Atlanta.
Yeah, it's killer. And then disc 3 is like rarities and outtakes and stuff.
Right.
And I can't find this, but there's also a bonus DVD of them performing in Brazil in 2009. So that version, if you can find that, it's 3 discs and a DVD. Great, great one to have.
So yeah, I was wrong. Bowie was involved in the production of that, but they make it clear in the documentary they were pretty much left alone. So the official production credit goes to David Bowie and Iggy Pop, but it's clear that they were kind of unsupervised for the most part when they were recording that. But the songwriting's killer. But really quick though, since the Heavy Liquid stuff was recorded before Raw Power, I just want to talk about that a little bit. There's a song on Heavy Liquid that should have been on Raw Power. Really, a lot of these songs should have been. I Got It Right. That song on Heavy Liquid they're almost predicting the hardcore punk movement. It's so fast. It's just blistering fast and locked in, just tight and fast and killer. Another classic that a lot of these would show up on bootlegs throughout the years. Cock in My Pocket is a classic. Open Up and Bleed is a classic. There's a great biography of Iggy Pop, and the author called it Open Up and Bleed after this unreleased, quote unquote, unreleased song. So there's a bunch of good tunes on there. I would recommend definitely check out Heavy Liquid, and if you make yourself a Stooges playlist, put it on there next to Raw Power, because it's really the other.
All the songs we're talking about are on the All Night Till I Blow Away playlist that was compiled for this show.
Yeah, Silky rocked another playlist out of the park here. You cats got to check it out.
They do a great cover of Louie Louie too. That's
yeah. Good. The Louie Louie cover is really good. So a lot of good stuff. But go ahead. I'm sure you got some notes on Raw Power to lay down for these cats.
Well, Raw Power comes out in 73. Just so many good tracks on there. Gimme Danger. Your Pretty Face Is Going to Hell. Just such a great record.
Shake Appeal.
Shake Appeal. I love that one too. God, that's
Search and Destroy. Can't forget that one.
Covered by the Chili Peppers before they turned
into. This is the last time. No more mentioning the Red Hot Chili Peppers on a Stooges podcast. Yeah, if we ever do an Air Supply podcast, we can mention them as much as we want.
Yeah,
because that's where they are now. They're Air Supply.
Oh, they're worse than Aerosmith, really.
They're definitely. Yeah, it's the same thing. It's just pop crap. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was not a commercial success. It's gained a cult following. It's you know, the Stooges and then Funhouse and Raw Power, solid 3 records.
Yeah, that was a three-peat.
There's no dip in quality.
That was a hat trick.
They really bring it, and it's interesting. Again, MC5, same kind of career, but it's like the Stooges billed as the smaller band. They got the production, they got the studio time,
They got the songwriting.
Yeah, I just think they lucked out.
They were historically they're the bigger band, no question. Historically,
yeah. It's nuts that would happen. But there's no filler on this record. Gimme Danger, Penetration, Death Trip. This whole record is
Death Trip. Is that not a punk rock title? I mean, come on. Yeah. These guys. Somewhere I watch a doc, and I'm sorry I keep harping on this, but it just annoys me whenever I hear anybody saying anybody else was the first punk band. Even the New York Dolls were after these guys. Right. So some punk rock documentary I watched, and they said Jonathan Richman started punk rock.
Oh like, God.
I was gonna destroy. No, I mean,
you could put something on Screamin' Jay Hawkins. Just any early group that just screamed into the microphone and had the raw energy. I mean, Buddy Holly, some of that stuff. They were sure. Get up and just shred.
The first band that fully embodied punk rock
trio, you know, those guys.
The first band that fully embodied punk rock was the Stooges. Full stop.
And then you had Death, same guys out of Detroit.
There's a great documentary on Death. Look that up. You had a lot of stuff in Detroit. So since we're mentioning Detroit, the scene there, you had the MC5. You had a lot of those garage rock bands we were talking about. You had Alice Cooper, basically not the solo guy, but the group. They basically settled in Detroit. You know, they started in Arizona, moved out to California. They settled in Detroit and really became their own in Detroit. And Iggy Pop actually says that the Alice Cooper group, basically, when the Alice Cooper group started, they were this experimental weirdo band. And
they didn't really find a groove to that third record. And then
what's his name? Bob Ezrin started producing them, and he helped them focus. But they had seen the Stooges. They were aware of the Stooges. And Iggy basically says, they did our act better than we did. Basically, they had better songwriting, which, man, those early Alice Cooper group albums, the songwriting was phenomenal. I said phenomenal again. He said they basically did our act better than we did. We thought we were going to get on the radio and become popular. And then they did our thing for us, and they got on the radio and became popular. Said it was good rock and roll singing and really good songwriting. And they, if you look at early Alice Cooper group footage on YouTube, they looked like the Stooges. They looked a lot like the Stooges.
Yeah. So then it just kind of falls apart, and Iggy would go on to do 3 fairly decent solo records with David Bowie.
Before we get into that, we got to mention the live album Metallic KO.
Okay, that came out in '76.
Yeah, that's a classic Iggy.
Yeah, but I don't know if that is from an older show, like
it is. It's from the Raw Power lineup.
Yeah. So, like I said, that one at Richards in Atlanta, it's the same. It's that same tour. So Metallic KO is just like somewhere else on that tour,
but it's a classic, basically
it really is.
Classic live bootleg album that came out. And there's
And
one
that's all you
song.
had for years. You didn't have any live Stooges before.
Yeah.
Metallic KO was it. I remember us listening to that on Courtney.
Yeah. Yeah.
Back
And
in the
it's basically this bootleg that became a classic album. And there's one song on there that's not on anything else, which is Rich Bitch, which is a really good song.
yeah, God.
So, 11
God.
minutes of ranting about a rich bitch.
Yes.
Anyways, go ahead.
See if that's on.
It's on Rhapsody.
Well,
I mean, it's on Spotify.
No, I want to see if that's on the live version of that's included with Raw Power.
Oh,
I don't see. No, they don't. It's not in that.
yeah.
It sucks.
Anyways, that's just. I just wanted to mention that because first of all, the album is classic. You can hear them arguing with the audience and all the shit that would happen.
Yeah.
Because nobody understood punk rock, so they play these shows, and the audience is expecting a conventional rock and roll show, and a lot of times they'd end up having stuff thrown at them the whole time. Very few audiences were ready for a Stooges show.
Yeah,
at that time.
Much like seeing the Sex Pistols were spitting on each, up on the stage and stuff. Yeah. Just was not anything you were ready for.
I remember seeing newscasts of, and this is like on YouTube somewhere or in a punk rock documentary, news anchors warning parents that the Sex Pistols are coming to town and keep your children away from this band. And
oh my God,
when punk rock got bigger and really started permeating the culture, and at that time you had the Sex Pistols basically leading the charge and the Ramones, it was still threatening and it still freaked people out. It's just that you had a subculture of youth that were totally behind it at that point. They're like, yeah let's freak people. It wasn't just 5 guys from Detroit leading the charge. It was a whole subculture. And
what's funny too, on the Sex Pistols front, they had some gig out in like Denver or some shit. Here's this punk band with all the buttons and mohawks and dyed hair, and they're ready to fight, and they end up out in some podunk jamboree thing, and the radio station set it up, and they had food, and they just literally sat at picnic tables with these cowboy redneck people that were like, wow, you're from England, and they didn't know how to take these people because they were so nice, and they ate, and then they got up and played, and they were like, well, that's not anything we expect, but
it don't sound like Conway Twitty, but I guess it's okay.
They were just so nice to these punk rockers, and I forget what documentary you saw that in, but it's hysterical.
Yeah,
and it was one of the few. It was actually one of the few live shows that they did in the United States in that initial run. You know
where their first show was when the Sex Pistols first hit the U.S.?
I'm not sure.
Atlanta.
Oh, really?
It was originally going to be New York, and that show got canceled, and it was Atlanta. And I'm trying to remember the name of the shopping mall. There was a club in a shopping mall. You remember where the Film Forum used to be in Buckhead?
Yeah.
It was there. It might have been that building.
Wow.
It was in that shop, Broadview Plaza or whatever it was called.
Yeah. I don't.
Yeah. But anyways, and by the time Black Flag came along, it was such an issue that the cops would bust punk rock shows. If you read the history of Black Flag, the cops are always busting up their shows, and
it was terrible because they just these kids just need an outlet, and they're going to play, and the cops just come hoping to bust some heads, and that's just
it was considered a threat to society, and it all started with these fuckers from
I
Michigan.
can remember
really, they're from Ann Arbor, not Detroit, but anyways,
I can remember a Quincy episode that was basically telling the children this punk thing is going to destroy your children.
Yeah, it was the bad guys were punk rockers. I remember seeing that episode. Yeah.
I'm currently way into season 3 of Chips, and I know there was a Chips episode that dealt with punk rock.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, and it was always just warning the parents, keep your kids away from.
Yeah, it's just but in the 80s too, the 80s had the satanic panic is what
there's always and Elvis gyrating his hips on Ed Sullivan, so they got to film him from the waist up. It's just all idiocracy.
Again, the studios trying to smite out the dangerous factors of rock and roll.
Oh yeah, the older generation trying to freaking out about the younger generation.
We've got to polish this off and give you new kids on the block instead of anything.
Instead of Dead Boys,
Yeah.
So who also covered the Stooges? Dead Boys covered the Stooges. So what do you got after Raw Power? You got you mentioned
a lot of years go by. They finally in 2007 put out their 4th album, The Weirdness.
And before that, so basically what happens is Iggy goes off and does, records a couple albums with Brian Eno and David Bowie.
That's what I was started to talk about. But
in Germany and Berlin, and then
Iggy kind of produces some of David Bowie's stuff in Berlin.
Now, I think it was Bowie producing Iggy.
Right, but no, Iggy is involved with those Brian Eno records that Bowie did. I think Brian Eno did 3 with Bowie in Germany. But
he did Heroes and Berlin for sure. He did those 2.
There's another one, but
I didn't know Iggy was involved with those, but he might have been. Yeah, so who knows? But
they were like hanging out in Berlin.
Oh yeah. So they were all there, yeah. The drivers of all that, though, I think was Brian Eno and David Bowie. Kind of, hey Iggy, why don't you come out and get hip to what we're doing?
Well, and what's Iggy got to do? Let me go back home to Ann Arbor.
Oh no, he was totally wanting to have a career in music, and he just kept going. Yeah. And I've marathoned every Iggy Pop album before, and it's an interesting journey. There's a lot of kind of. He goes through a whole lot of different iterations and touches on
the Idiot was good.
Lust for Life.
Lust for Life is really his classic for sure.
Yeah. And at some point we might do an Iggy Pop episode and really delve into his solo career. But sticking on the Stooges front, so then Ron Ashton joins a band called New Order, not the New Wave New Order that came later, but a different band called New Order. And then he's in a band called Destroy All Monsters. Scott Ashton was playing in the Sonic Rendezvous band with Fred Sonic Smith from the MC5, who ended up later marrying Patti Smith. There was a band called Gang War that was Ron Ashton and Wayne Kramer. And they never recorded a proper studio album, but you can find like a live album. And Gang War was Johnny Thunders. Never mind, sorry, that was Johnny Thunders and Wayne Kramer.
I was gonna say, I thought that was
that's worth checking out though. But so they all kind of went off and did their own things. Iggy basically managed to establish himself a solo career. Never became a huge superstar. I mean, he was playing 6888, the local punk club here in the early 80s.
I mean, he might not have had the money he wanted, but I think he retained that crown of just, oh shit, it's Iggy Pop. you know.
Well, once punk rock blew up, then he was the godfather of punk, basically, you know? And so that kept him, he could play the punk rock circuit for as long as he wanted.
Well, and you take every punk band there's ever been. Nobody's got the mileage that Iggy Pop has.
Yeah. He's been, and he's the only
you could
surviving.
name all these singers from all these different punk bands, and most of those punk bands did one album, two albums, a couple of singles. Iggy Pop is test of time, you know.
He's the only Stooge still alive right now.
It's last man standing.
Yep. But so before they do the weirdness in 2007, Iggy is doing another one of his another album. I think it was called Skull Ring, and it was basically, he was at the point where the record company was like, you're either going to get produced and sound like Aerosmith does now, or the Red Hot Chili Peppers do now.
Yeah.
Or you can do an all-star album, sound like yourself, but you got to bring in a lot of guest stars. So he opted for the second option, and there's 4 songs on there where the guest stars on the song are the Stooges. And basically what had happened, what inspired him to do that, was that Jay Mascis from Dinosaur Jr. Basically started jamming with Ron and Scott Ashton. And Mike Watt from the Minutemen basically was brought in to play bass, and they were touring as Ashton, Mascis, and Watt, and playing those Stooges songs from the first 2 albums really well, getting killer reviews, just tearing it down.
Oh yeah, that was like the latter half of the show was just all Stooges, and what a set that would have been. God.
Yeah, they basically toured with Jay Mascis on his solo tour. He would play his stuff, and then he'd bring them on, and they would just be Stooges jam. And then they played all Tomorrow's Parties, full show, just Ashton, Mascis, and Watt. And I think they started doing full shows of Stooges songs after that for a while, touring as that was the name of the band, Ashton, Mascis, and Watt. And so Iggy's looking for people to guest on this all-star album, sees that this is going on. He's like, fuck, I'll bring the Ashton brothers and Mike Watt over here, and we'll do some songs as the Stooges. So on Skull Ring, you've got Little Electric Chair, the song Skull Ring, Loser, and Dead Rock Star. And it's billed as Iggy Pop, comma, the Stooges. Whereas, you know, you'll have Iggy Pop, comma, whoever the other guest star is on the other songs. And the lineup was the Stooges, you know, with Mike Watt on bass. And them recording those 4 songs together, that basically set it in motion. They're like, okay, what's next? You know, I'm sure Iggy didn't want to get produced. I'm sure he didn't want to keep doing these all-star albums. And he's like, well, what if I get the Stooges back together? Will you release that? And you've got the weirdness. And honestly, I've listened to the weirdness probably twice in my life. I don't feel like it's the same level as the three-peat, those first 3 albums.
Sure.
But it is the Stooges, and it's definitely worth listening to and jamming, and it's definitely better than 95% of all the other crap that's out there.
So in 2010, there's this like got unearthed somewhere. An album was called Have Some Fun Live at Ungano's, and it's them live in 1970 on that Funhouse, you know.
Oh, nice.
And Ungano's. This was put out by Rhino in 2010. I want to say like a record store day, or I remember when this came out, and it was like really snatched up. It was on vinyl, but it's them live, you know, on that Funhouse tour. It's good stuff. 1970. Cool. Yeah.
So a little bit more on the weirdness. So also Steve McKay was on that album, jamming saxophone, and when they toured, they brought him on tour with them, and it was produced by Steve Albini of Big Black and Shellac, which are both good bands. And you know he's the legendary no bullshit indie producer. I think he doesn't even like being called a producer. He for a while in the 90s, he was insisting on being called an engineer when he would produce albums. Just pretentious.
Was a genius, though.
Yeah, produced in Nirvana's In Utero and a ton of just classic indie albums as well.
Yeah, I think he did Jesus Lizard. Lafarge is all about this guy. So
yeah, Jason Lafarge, who we interviewed on one of our previous episodes, who works as a recording engineer. Yeah, I've got a list here. The Breeders, Jesus Lizard, Godspeed You Black Emperor, Pixies, Superchunk, Neurosis.
Yeah, Pixies and Jesus Lizard. I'm so glad I got that right. Jay would have come down and killed me.
So just a ton of these bands, and his band Shellac is actually really good. I'd recommend checking that out. Yeah. So, and he was kind of the trendy producer for a while. He even produced Page and Plant when they did their reunion album. So anything else to say about the weirdness? There's a good live concert from that era that's out there.
Yeah, there's a couple DVDs of them in the early 2000s that are just tremendous. You really get an idea of what they had. I mean, you think, here's Iggy Pop in his 60s up there with his shirt off, strutting around and just giving it 110% up on stage. And it's not embarrassing. I can think of bands that had been around at that time. You put them on stage now, that they can't bring it the way Iggy just delivers these songs that were written with such passion and anger, and he's just right there all these years later. There's a DVD of them on some big tour, some big package thing through Europe. But then April of 2013, their fifth and final studio album, Ready to Die, comes out. This is I listened to a couple of songs from this today. I dig the music. The album cover is just Iggy Pop.
Yeah,
I hate the album cover. It's terrible.
I've listened to this album once, and same reaction that I had to the weirdness. It's definitely Iggy and the Stooges. One thing that happened between these two albums in 2009, Ron Asheton bit the dirt, kicked the bucket, went on to Valhalla, whatever you want to say. Mm-hmm. So with him dead, the Stooges wanted to keep going, but they're not going to just go grab Joe Perry, right? It's got to still be the Stooges. And James Williamson, since he had left the Stooges in the 70s, basically studied electrical engineering, went out to Silicon Valley. By this time,
he for 20 years, so he probably made some serious money out there.
Yeah, no, he was clocking bank out there. And basically, right around this time when Ron Asheton dies, James Williamson is retiring. He was an executive at Sony, and he was retiring. And they called him up, and they said, man, we can't do the Stooges anymore because Ron's gone, but we could still do Iggy and the Stooges. Mm-hmm. Will you please come join us? And he basically said he felt like these are old buddies of him, and they were counting on him because they wanted to keep it going. Yeah. And he had to step up, and he hadn't played guitar in years, but that's perfect for punk rock. Because if he had become this Al Di Meola virtuoso, it wouldn't have worked, right?
Yeah.
So he's back to the raw sound that he had back then because he hadn't been practicing, which is important to not practice if you're true punk. And he came back and they recorded this album, Ready to Die. and again, I've only listened to it once. I liked it, but it's not the three-peat in my mind. But so the lineup is Iggy Pop, Scott Ashton on drums, Mike Watt on bass, James Williamson on guitar, and Steve McKay still clocking in on the sax. And that was the last Stooges album. Scott Ashton ended up kicking the bucket in 2014.
Yeah, he died a year later.
Yeah.
And even in that movie, he just sounds...
he looks, in the documentary, he looks like he's on the edge of death.
Yeah, I would say a couple of strokes or something. Yeah. He's not firing on all cylinders.
The next year, Steve McKay kicks the bucket, so there's no Stooges after that. No. Iggy's back to doing solo stuff, but they just really it's like a few kids from Ann Arbor, Michigan, going swimming for a few years, and then they somehow change the course of the ocean. I mean, it's really amazing what they did.
Yeah, and I would say, much like bands that are still around and everything they're doing today is solely based on albums they did 40 years ago. The Stooges will never lose their shimmer and shine. Their power is fully intact with those first three records.
Yeah, they are the first three punk rock albums. I don't know when the first New York Dolls album came out, but that if that was before Raw Power, then maybe that's one. But anyways, they're just perfect. Perfect punk rock albums. They set a template that's still being followed today by any band worth their muster.
Yeah, they've got nothing to be ashamed of, for sure.
Yeah, phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
Phenomenal.
Yeah, that first New York Dolls was 73. I thought it was 73. So, I mean,
when was Raw Power?
73.
Okay, yeah, same year. Yeah,
but Funhouse and the first one.
Yeah. Again, these guys were recording punk rock when the Beatles were still together.
Yeah,
you got to think about that.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's the Stooges, kids. Go out and rock that shit.
And we will we'll be linking this killer playlist that Silky made. Link to the book Open Up and Bleed. We'll link to the Gimme Danger documentary, and if I can find that Stooges The Weirdness Tour video, I'll link that as well. And get hip to some Stooges if you haven't heard them. Most of you cats listening probably have heard them. And just again, welcome back, motherfuckers.
There you go. Check out the website, snagsandsilky.com, and get all the playlists going. Check some shit out. Learn about some music.
Yeah, or learn more about the music you already love. So
there you go.
We got more shit coming. It's planned. We're not going to jinx it by talking about it, but more shit's on the way. So stay tuned. Snags and Silky signing out for tonight. Peace out, bitches.